Spec Ops The Line begins as your average military shooter with a story so generic it makes duty calls look like a nuanced piece of literature.
Oh, I'm dead.
The premise of Spec Ops is simple. Dubai has been destroyed by a sandstorm and it's up to you and your squad mates to go in and fix it. Along the way you run into armed resistance, have to fight your way through the city, etc. If you've played any military shooter before, you get the idea. Sort of. Because halfway through its campaign, this game takes a turn. In Chapter 8, The Gate, you commandeer a white phosphorus mortar in order to clear out an enemy camp and progress deeper into the city. Walking through the aftermath, however, you realise that something's wrong.
We were helping.
What? Oh no.
It wasn't combatants you just incinerated, but civilians gathered within the camp for safety. The camera zooms in on the charred remains of a mother and her child as you're forced to come to terms with what you've done. This is the turning point of Spec Ops The Line, the gut punch that forces you to confront the reality of what you've done, the crushing weight of an action you took for granted up until this moment. Even before the big reveal, the game tries to bring home the reality of what it is you're doing. Unlike in other games, you aren't thousands of feet in the air when firing on your targets, you're close enough to actually hear their screams as you rain down death from above. Not only that, the entire time you're operating the mortar, you see your character, Martin Walker, reflected in the screen. The game is highlighting, once again, your part in all of this devastation, before you're forced to walk through the aftermath of what you've done, and you learn the truth of who it is you've just done it to. At every step of this sequence, the game is telling you over and over again that you did this is your fault, and this fact follows you through the rest of the entire game. Not just the narrative, mind you, the game itself seems to shame you for what you've done here, through haunting, anomalous loading screens, or the hints in said loading screens devolving from normal advice to straight up anger towards you. Everything in the game ties back to this moment. The moment where you did something so heinous that the game itself seems to hate you for it and makes no secret of that fact. With all of this considered, a key question arises. What could you have done differently in this scenario? What can you do to guarantee that you aren't the monster this game so clearly thinks you are? What other choice do you have? And the answer is, you don't. You don't have a choice here. If you try to progress without using the white phosphorus, you'll be overrun with invincible enemies until you die and have to start over, only able to progress once you do use it, which raises the question, is it fair for the game developers to force you to do something and then criticize you for doing it? The general consensus is no. People don't like being needlessly judged by a game they're playing, as it turns out. There's been a lot of criticism thrown at this game for how it handles the morality of your actions. People complain that the game is preachy, or that the creators are pretentious for handling it in the way that they did. I've heard people ask why you would go through all the effort of making a game only to judge people for playing it. This is how I felt for a long time as well. I used to think it would be better if there was another way through, one that wasn't immediately apparent but still possible. That way, when you did go through with using the white phosphorus, it would be even more impactful when you realised that you could have done something differently but didn't. I was embarrassingly committed to this idea. I would bring it up whenever Spec Ops came up in conversation. I just couldn't stomach the idea that I was being punished for something that I was forced to do. And this got me thinking. How could this have been handled differently? How has it been handled differently? Spec Ops sets out to do something very simple. Take all the common genre expectations and mechanics that its player takes for granted and flip them on their head. Bring attention to the actual weight and significance of your actions within a game world and the nature of your own interaction with a fundamentally interactive art form. People say that Spec Ops falls short because it offers you no choices, no freedom, no agency. So what would Spec Ops look like if it did grant you freedom in how you solve problems? One game above all others stands out as a demonstration of this exact approach, a game that truly aims to test its player through the decisions they make and highlight the nature of their interactions within the game world and the consequences that result from it. A game called... Okay, I thought that I was being really clever by making that comparison, or that I'd be able to annoy my audience by making such an obviously outrageous claim, but it turns out I'm kind of late to the party. A lot of people have compared Spec Ops to Undertale, to the point that there's still academic papers being written about it, which makes sense because these games have similar goals. But what I love about them is that they have wildly different approaches in meeting that goal. If Spec Ops makes its point by denying the player freedom and control in the overarching story, Undertale, in contrast, gives its player an abundance of freedom. And that ability to do whatever you want in a fully realized world and the consequences resulting from your actions is where this game truly shines. Toby Fox knows gamers. He knows that they're coming into video games expecting a constructed reality that's primarily built around serving the player first and being a fully fleshed out world somewhere down the line. And he spends the entirety of Undertale flipping that on its head, pointing out all the little ways that the conventions of a video game world clash with a world that people actually live in. Sometimes he uses this to great comedic effect, like when you get to the first proper town area of the game and decide that you want to sell some of the junk you've picked up along the way, only to find out that you can't because, well, yeah, that's not how it works in a world that makes sense. This is just a silly example that highlights the absurdity of some video game mechanics that the player would still be taking for granted, but this principle extends to the much more fundamental aspects of gameplay, like combat. So let's say you're like me running around the ruins in chapter 1 and keep getting interrupted by this fucking frog who wants to fight you, so you get sick and tired of it and decide to give it the fight it's looking for, only to find that... whoops. This is why Toriel, your guardian at the start of the game, tells you that you should run away instead of fighting. It's not because it's the goody two-shoes option that gets you the true ending. Well, it is, but it's also because from her perspective, you're actually in this world fighting and very possibly killing its inhabitants. Thankfully, Undertale is a lot more forgiving than Spec Ops in this regard. You get a little bit of murder as a treat. So if you're like me and accidentally kill a single monster, it doesn't mean that you're wholly irredeemable. It just means that you had a bit of a whoopsie daisy and can't get the true ending. But if you keep going and killing every monster you come across, the game becomes different. The town area I mentioned earlier will be abandoned, its upbeat theme song won't play, instead replaced by an ominous soundscape, and its inhabitants will have fled, leaving you notes begging for mercy. This is what's referred to as a genocide playthrough, and the name is quite fitting because genocide is, bad, which you wouldn't think is a controversial thing to say nowadays, but here we are. But it's a fitting name because it refers to the player's deliberate choice to kill everyone they come across, and this is where I want to talk about ludonarrative for a second, referring to the intersection between a game's ludic elements, or gameplay, and its greater narrative. You've probably heard the far more popular phrase ludonarrative dissonance thrown around, referring to those moments in video games where the gameplay and narrative are at odds with one another, like in the 2013 Tomb Raider reboot where baby Lara Croft can murk hundreds of mercs and not break a sweat. Discussions of ludonarrative have something of a bad reputation, seen as something employed mainly by pretentious critics who want to criticize games for having fun gameplay. And while I'm certainly guilty of doing this myself, I think it's a useful tool when examining a game like Undertale that wants to examine the narrative function of its player within the game world through gameplay. You can see this expressed through the way you actually begin a genocide playthrough. You don't just go up to a predetermined place to find every monster, they spawn randomly. Not only that, but the time between encounters increases with each kill, and this is effective on two fronts. First, it makes you feel the impact of what you're doing. You're in this world, killing off its inhabitants one by one. Of course they're going to get harder to find. But more importantly, it means that the only way to achieve this sort of run is to deliberately and intentionally hunt down every single monster in an area, and that intent behind the violence you're committing is what Toby Fox wants to bring attention to to and criticize, either through you deliberately waiting longer and longer just to kill another monster, or the fact that as you progress, the combat gets less and less fulfilling. Just click once and you're done. The game becomes mechanically less fun as your level of violence increases, eventually resulting in the player only killing just to kill, becoming numb to the violence and only continuing out of a single-minded desire to keep going. In doing this, Undertale achieves what's called ludonarrative harmony, where the two elements of gameplay and narrative interact and build upon one another seamlessly. And what's truly amazing about this game is that this is consistent no matter how you engage with it. If you play it as intended, in a pacifist run, the combat mechanics and options for gameplay remain fun. Regular enemies have unique mechanics that you don't see anywhere else, like this blind dog who you can pass as long as you don't move, or a wannabe comedian dragon thing who you can beat by laughing at his stand-up routine, or not laughing if you're lame. The game is full of interesting mechanics like this that reward your choice to engage with it sincerely. Approach it as though your actions within this game world actually do carry significance, and treat that fact with the importance it deserves. But the most genius thing about this path is that you're constantly tempted to stray from it. The pacifist route demands that you stay vulnerable, that you miss out on certain upgrades that would otherwise make the playthrough easy, and you're forced to deal with monsters like that fucking frog cornering you into combat encounters over and over again, and you have to survive until you can run away with way less health than you'd have otherwise. This means that the player is constantly forced into making a decision as to whether or not the increased difficulty and hassle is worth the good ending. They have to keep making the decision to do the right thing, no matter how much of an obstacle that proves to be. Now, with all of this considered, you're probably expecting me to say that this is how Spec Ops should have handled the white phosphorus scene. Give the player another choice, but make it extremely difficult or inconvenient, or even keep it as obscure as possible, open only to those who think of it in the first place. And that's all well and good if you're only considering Chapter 8, because looking at the rest of the game, this becomes something of a moot point. As it turns out, Spec Ops does have a scene that uses this exact approach, a scene that I would argue is even more impactful than the white phosphorus scene. At the beginning of Chapter 13, you're separated from your squad mates, Adams and Lugo. You manage to reunite with Adams, but Lugo radios in, screaming for help. You eventually manage to reach him, but he's been lynched by a crowd of angry civilians. As you cut him down and attempt to revive him, the crowd slowly closes in on you, and you learn that it's too late. Lugo is dead. The objective simply reads, "Get the hell out of here," and you realise that the only way forward is through the crowd who have just killed your friend. With no other option in sight, you raise your gun and open fire. Or do you? Something I've neglected to mention up until now is why these civilians are so hostile towards you in the first place. After all, you're there to help, right? So, in Chapter 10, you and your squad are recruited by CIA agent Riggs to hijack a convoy of trucks carrying the last of the city's water supply, in an effort to cripple the 33rd who were holding it. You manage to steal the water, but face heavy resistance. As it seems like you're about to be overwhelmed, Riggs reveals his true intentions.
Sorry, boys, but they ain't getting this water back. No matter the cost. He's crashing the trucks!
And dooms the city by destroying the last of their water, to wipe out the remaining witnesses of everything the Americans have done.
If people find out what he did, the whole region will declare war on us, and we'll lose. Now the world will never know.
The game makes it very clear how badly you've fucked up.
Go on, get the fuck out of here!
And you're once again left to confront the reality of what you've done. This is another important step in the game's deconstruction of the hero narrative you might still be following. Its continued effort to point out that in trying to help and be the hero, you've only made everything worse, and the people you think you're saving despise you for it. And all of this comes to a head in this moment from Chapter 13. Knowing all of this context, knowing everything you've done, and the fact that you've doomed the city to a slow death from thirst, it makes complete sense that these civilians would want to kill you and your squad mates, right? You can't really say that your one squad mate's death is entirely unfair when you weigh it up against everything else you've done up until this point, can you? And this is where the true genius of this scene is revealed. because you don't have to fire into the crowd to get through here. If you knock over the guy closest to you or fire into the air, the crowd will flee and allow you safe passage. But of course, the game doesn't make a big show of telling you that. In fact, as the crowd closes in on you, Adams pleads with you to give him the order to fire.
Walker, give me the fucking word!
The player has to use their own judgment to do what they think is right, and that judgment is what the game is putting to the test. To me, this is the defining moment of Spec Ops: The Line. The moment where, having previously made you aware that your actions have consequences in Chapter 8, the game finally offers you a chance to exercise that awareness, test you, to see if you reject the violence you previously took for granted, or revel in it, refusing to take the game's messaging to heart. I mean, the achievements you get from either of these options basically confirm that this is the defining moment of the entire game, the test where you hold or cross the line in Spec Ops: The Line. The test that I failed when I first played through the game. I couldn't accept that I wasn't the hero, and because of that, did something truly villainous. Bear in mind, this was after I decided that this game needed this exact scenario, a choice where it isn't obvious that you can choose, and I still failed. It's like the game developers knew what I was thinking after the white phosphorus, that obviously if I was given the choice I would pick the correct option, and they said, okay, prove it. But I couldn't. You crafty fuckers, you got me to do a war crime twice. But the true beautiful irony of this choice is that even if you do spare the crowd, it doesn't make a difference in the long run. Remember, the entire reason they kill Lugo in the first place is because you've destroyed the last of their water supply. What you do with the civilians here ultimately doesn't matter because, to put it bluntly, you've already killed them. Sparing them here might feel like you're rejecting more violence, but ultimately it only really serves to protect your self-perception. And this brings me to another way that I see a lot of games giving their players agency, not by giving them loads of control over what's happening around them or even having any influence in the game's story, but giving them a lot of space to react to and cope with it. To give you an example of what I mean, I want to briefly segue away from Spec Ops and talk about Firewatch for a little bit. The story of Firewatch is simple. You go to work in the wilderness as a fire lookout, various spooky things start happening, and you eventually have to evacuate because of a fire caused by your investigation into said spooky happenings. Now, I just want to say straight up that you have no impact on these events, they're set in stone. Gameplay is limited to exploring the wilderness, checking out various points of interest, and picking dialogue options when talking to fellow lookout Delilah, who helps you in your investigation. And this limited form of engagement with Firewatch has led to a lot of people calling it a walking simulator, which I think is quite unfair. There's also repelling. But in all seriousness, I think this limited agency the player is given isn't so much a weakness in the game's storytelling, but rather its entire foundation. The story of Firewatch is the story of your character, Henry, whose wife is diagnosed with early onset dementia and has to move away to receive treatment. That's why he's in the wilderness to begin with. He's been thrown into a situation far beyond his control and is scrambling to deal with it in some way, or rather not have to deal with it. This is how Firewatch approaches the agency it does allow its player. It's not a game where the world is significantly impacted by your actions, like Undertale is, but rather seeing how you deal with what's happening around you. In this sense, Firewatch can be described as an interactive personality test. In fact, the game's prologue literally is a personality test, setting up the idea that ultimately you're just some guy going through some stuff, and how you go through it is the thematic backbone of the rest of the game. At no point does the game ever provide a moral judgment or significance to the choices you do make. If anything, the game takes great care to allow you long stretches of silence between each conversation. This is where those numerous walking segments actually come in super handy as a narrative device. Every conversation and its consequence is given time to breathe, and in the silence you're able to contemplate the choices you do make, wonder about where you're headed, and even if there's something you could have done differently. And as a result of this hands-off approach to moralizing, the game allows you to prescribe meaning to your own choices. The closest the game gets to any explicit commentary on your actions is if you make Delilah angry after one optional conversation, and even then it's just to give you a context clue because, well, you're a gamer and don't know how human interaction works. But even then, all the game does is continue its silence and allow you to think about what you've done and the significant effect your choice has had on your relationship with Delilah. Speaking of, let's talk about Delilah for a second. So, a common way I see people interacting with this game is playing it as though it's a dating sim, picking all of the romantic options so they can get the girl and unlock the good ending.
What could we do?
Well, let me tell you.
But that's not how it plays out. No matter what dialogue option you pick, Delilah will evacuate the forest fire before you can make it to her cabin and meet her in person. Even if she agrees to wait for you, she'll still pack up and leave before you get to her. And this is a common source of criticism of the game. You know, people will call it railroady or cheap. They'll question why you were even given choices if they ultimately don't matter. Sound familiar? But I feel like these criticisms reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is Firewatch is actually trying to do, and result from approaching this game as though it's a puzzle to be solved, or as if there is an optimal way to engage with it and win. But Firewatch isn't that type of game. It's a game about two people who've been put into an unwinnable situation and the ways in which they're dealing with that, or more accurately, failing to. And this is where the player is given the most control over the game's narrative. Do you hold true to your sick wife and use the memory of her and where you came from to get through your ordeal in the forest? Or do you abandon her to try and escape your past and pursue an ultimately doomed relationship with your manager, you scumbag? But in all seriousness, none of these options are necessarily wrong, and this is why I'm so glad that there's no true ending. If there was a proper way to play through this game, it would completely undermine what Firewatch is aiming to do, which is push the player to ask questions about themselves, about how they deal with situations they find themselves in, and ultimately what they find important.
You're fumbling? I'm fumbling on purpose. Henry is married!
And the perfect encapsulation of this approach, the truly beautiful way the game allows you to discover what you were impacted by, is through its camera mechanic. Halfway through the game, you find a camera. It's just hanging up on a ledge somewhere, but you grab it and it allows you to take photos. But it's a disposable camera with a limit, and there's only 17 photos left to take. Because of this, you have to decide how to allocate those photographs, if you even want to. Yeah, there are times where Delilah recommends you take a photo of something for evidence in your investigation, but that's not required. It only happens a couple of times, so there's plenty of room for you to take photos of anything. And what I love about this is that after all is said and done, once you've discovered the secret of everything going on around you and you've evacuated and parted ways with Delilah, the credits roll, alongside all of the pictures you took throughout your playthrough. The big fire, a nice looking sunset, the lookout tower standing tall over the treetops, or even evidence of your investigation. The game offers you one last chance to appreciate the things that stood out to you the most while playing through it, and reveal in 17 images the way you engaged with the game's story and ultimately what you took away from it. This is what I was talking about when I called Firewatch an interactive personality test. At every step, this game forces you to answer questions based on your values and then forces you to confront those decisions, question and reflect on them, and maybe learn a little bit more about yourself in the process. It is a deeply personal and human game that in many ways ends up being about the human playing it. This approaches how I would discuss Spec Ops: The Line. It is a game that, much like Firewatch, aims to strip its player of agency in order to reveal things about what they do in light of that and allow them to discover something about themselves in the process. But whereas Firewatch relies on a very hands-off approach, allowing the player to handle the situation in a way they see fit and draw significance from that accordingly, Spec Ops relies on a much more pointed method. So part of what makes this game's turning point so impactful is that the entire first half before the white phosphorus is deliberately constructed to lure you into a false sense of complacency, encouraging you to believe wholeheartedly that you're the good guy. You play as Captain Martin Walker, the leader of a super elite special forces unit called Delta Force. It's 3 of you against an entire battalion. No, an entire city, so it's kind of unfairly stacked. against the city. After all, you're the main character, America's super secret special forces boys, and you're there to save the city from the damn 33rd, the military force who've gone rogue and committed various atrocities in their effort to maintain their hold over Dubai. And if that's not bad enough, these guys spend the entire first half of the campaign fucking with you over and over again, making your life as miserable as possible. They kill the guy you go through a whole bunch of trouble to save, twice. They've kidnapped civilians, killed hostages, and spent the entire time taunting you over the radio while they do it.
We're looking for survivors. Well, you found some. It's a bitch, ain't it?
Oh, I can't wait to kill you in Chapter 12. Everything these guys do is deliberately constructed to make you hate them. I mean, Chapter 7 ends with these guys deploying white phosphorus on some of your allies in a moment that's genuinely horrifying the first time you experience it. Like, there's no dramatic musical cue or cutscene or anything, it just happens, and you're left to walk through the aftermath. So from my perspective, having seen all of this and then being presented with a white phosphorus mortar, I felt like I'd been given a chance to finally get my own back on these guys, get an easy win after the misery they put me through, and show them the pain that they'd been inflicting on others. Sure, Lugo had his objections.
You've seen what this shit does. You know we might not have a choice, Lugo. There's always a choice.
But he didn't understand. I wanted to do this. I wanted to get my revenge on these guys. I wanted to use that white phosphorus. So I got on the mortar, was presented with the exact black and white thermal imaging used in Call of Duty's AC-130 missions, and I opened fire. Now, again, mechanically, you can't do anything to change this. This game doesn't give you a choice. But the genius thing about this scene is that it doesn't have to. It spends the first 8 chapters gently nudging you towards willingly committing an atrocity far worse than anything you're saving the city from, and it does this by exploiting the hero complex it knows you have when you first sit down to play it, guiding you towards what it knows your first choice will be. Be honest, none of you guys tried to get through this scene without using the white phosphorus the first time round. You tried to go back and find another way, only to realise that you couldn't save Scum and had to commit to your decision. This game does something so much more effective than providing you with a choice in this instance. It predicts you. And that revelation that you've been so easily had is what makes this game's commentary on its player so impactful. Because while it's true that the game punishes you for something you had no choice in, chances are you didn't give yourself a choice. And this realization that you willingly gave up control in order to keep accepting your actions as just and righteous serves as the true thematic foundation for the rest of the game. In the same way that Walker refuses to see another way forward, so too does the player, and it's in this regard that the game is effortlessly able to place its player within the mind of its protagonist. Because of this, Walker and the player embark on nearly identical journeys over the course of this game. Their self-righteousness leads them to make a reckless decision with devastating consequences, and in their refusal to accept what they've done, they create a villain to place the blame on instead for forcing them to do this. For Walker, it's the 33rd and their leader, John Conrad.
I'm gonna make these bastards pay for what they've done. Now, are you with me or not?
And for the players, for me, that villain was the developers for not allowing me another way forward. The player, through their choices, their engagement with this violence and unwillingness to accept that they've done a bad thing, essentially becomes Walker. And this means that the questions raised throughout this campaign, the deconstruction of Walker's hero complex, his spiral into brutality as he gets more and more desperate to save the city, and the uncertainty of if he can ever truly come back from everything he's done, don't just apply to Walker, but you, the player. The game even conveys this through its Ludo narrative. Similar to Undertale, Spec Ops is designed in such a way that the gameplay and the psychological state of the player reflect one another. As you progress through the campaign, the enemies get stronger, they take longer to kill. the shooting starts to feel more sluggish and combat becomes dull, more of a chore than a challenge. But with Spec Ops, as opposed to Undertale, this is the only way you can engage with the game. While the specifics vary in a few isolated moments, the overall mechanics stay the same pretty much throughout. You shoot and you kill, and this cycle repeats until the campaign, which again you have basically no agency in, is over. Undertale, on the other hand, offers its players so many different ways of engaging with it that if you try to map them all out, the result is utterly incomprehensible. Does that mean that Undertale is inherently better in its commentary of its player than Spec Ops? I would say no. While Spec Ops is a linear and arguably railroad experience, that lack of agency does serve a narrative purpose. The entire point of the game is to bring to light the attitude of the person playing it, give them space to accept a scenario where they do go too far and commit an atrocity, and then turn around and say, hey, you were pretty willing to go along with that, weren't you? And this is what Spec Ops is ultimately about. It's not a game where you save the day, it's not even a game where you do the right thing. It's a game that confronts and interrogates the hero narratives we consume and accept in similar media. It's a game that asks questions about you, about how far you'll go when you feel like a hero, and offers you a chance to truly reflect on everything you've done up until this point, everything that informed it, and forces you to confront the fact that you are not the good guy. And the ways in which you choose to deal with that ever-growing realization, or more accurately, ignore it, is what this game is really trying to reveal. The boring shooting in this game is just another fascinating extension of that commentary. The player has to overcome a pretty big mechanical roadblock in this game's sluggish and clunky combat, to the point that they're essentially forcing themselves to finish the game while deriving basically no enjoyment from it. Again, much like Walker is doing in trying to finish his mission. And you can argue that it's silly to attach so much meaning to bad gameplay, or say that it's dumb to make a game that's deliberately no fun to play, but I think if any game should have these conversations surrounding it, it's the game that deliberately wants to ask why you would continue to carry on if there is no incentive to. If there's no complex mechanics, no branching, divergent paths, no good choices to be made, and maybe even no fun to be had playing it, then all Spec Ops has to do is ask its player one very simple question.
But on you marched. And for what?
So, what was all of this in service of? At the end of the campaign, you reach Conrad, the leader of the damned 33rd, who's been taunting you over the radio since the white phosphorus incident earlier on. It's revealed that he's been dead since before the campaign started, and all of your calls with him were hallucinations, figments of Walker's imagination, created to displace his guilt at what he's done. Once again, Conrad acts as a stand-in for the game's developers, telling you straight to your face that you aren't the good guy.
You're here because you wanted to feel like something you're not. A hero.
Before we're offered one last choice. Now, there's been a lot of debate as to which of this game's 4 endings is the true ending, but what I love about this game is that any one of them could be. Remember, the game's not just about Walker at this point, but you, the player. Whatever ending you get is ultimately a reflection of how this game's messaging has reached you, if at all. Do you shoot the reflection of Conrad? If so, you can choose to open fire on some newly arrived US reinforcements, missing Conrad and the developer's point, and ultimately losing yourself to the violence this game is vehemently against. Or you can go with them peacefully, coming to terms with what you've done and choosing instead to look forward. What I love about these two options is that they completely recontextualize your choice to shoot the hallucination of Conrad. If you embrace the violence, your choice to destroy Conrad is an extension of your lack of responsibility, denial until the very end that you did anything wrong, and refusal to accept the game developer's ultimate point, denying what's right in front of you. But if you choose to heed those words, drop your weapon and give up fighting, the destruction of Conrad is a destruction of the scapegoat that Walker and the player have relied on up until now. It's a moment where you're finally able to let go of the violence you've so readily accepted until this point. The last chance the game gives you to let go of the needless death and destruction you've caused throughout. Or you could choose to shoot your own reflection instead, in which case Walker will commit suicide. I view this option as something the player would do to finally try and accept responsibility for what they've done, deciding that there is no coming back, that Walker cannot be saved. And I think this ending choice is interesting in that, much like the crowd scene, it reveals the player's denial of their own complicity in all of this. Think about it, the entire game has blurred the boundaries between Walker and the player that he serves as an extension of. If you choose to kill Walker, believing that it ultimately serves as justice for everything that both of you have done, you aren't really taking responsibility, but continuing to run away from it, creating a villain to serve as a scapegoat for everything you've done, just like Walker did with Conrad. It ironically continues that cycle that the player thinks they're breaking by choosing this option, and falls short of the player actually accepting what they've done. Or you can do nothing, in which case Walker will still kill himself but imagines Conrad doing it, losing himself to his lack of responsibility and never coming to terms with his role in all of these atrocities, right up until the end. That's the attitude I had while playing this game, and for a long time afterwards. So I think it's only fitting that this was the ending I got. I still haven't played Spec Ops since that first time. Even talking about it now, 10 years later, I don't think I should play through it again. Knowing everything I do about it now, knowing the better choices that I could have made, and going back and playing through it again just to make them would feel wrong. Like I'm only doing it to soothe my ego, which kind of undermines the entire point of the game. I'll never have that first blind playthrough experience again, where all I had to rely on was my own judgment and what that said about me as a result. It's a game that uses its own interactivity to put responsibility on you for interacting with it, forcing you to reevaluate the common game mechanics and narratives that you take for granted, and have you confront the extent of your own control and agency and interaction with video games as a medium, blurring the boundary between character and player. In my case, I'm pretty sure I was the ideal target audience for this game. I wasn't critical about the narratives I consumed, I didn't question the things I did in order to be the main character, I just willingly went along with the ride because, well, I'm the good guy, right? Because of that, this game ended up being a lot less about Walker and being a lot more about me and the way I consume media, and it has some not so nice things to say about that. This was the first time I truly saw myself reflected in a game I was playing, and it forced me to reevaluate the way I consume media, turning me into the insufferable critic I am today. It's also why I think it's funny whenever I see someone complain about the lack of choices or good ending. It reveals a lot about their attitude towards this game, and also probably the choices they made while playing it. I mean, some people straight up brag about shooting into the crowd. You don't have to read between the lines at all. It's the video game equivalent of a Rorschach test, whereby the player, in focusing on what they think is important and even what they think is unfair, reveals a lot about themselves in the process and is the point of the game. It even extends beyond simply being about your actions within the game and starts asking questions about the fact that you're playing it at all. There's a lot of things I haven't discussed up until now, but I wanted to wrap up by discussing one line that I think perfectly summarizes this game's attitude towards your interaction with it, and it's this.
None of this would have happened if you just stopped.
This has nothing to do with Walker at this point. It is solely about you, the player. Spec Ops is ultimately a reaction to the culture that created it, a culture that accepts the dogmatism of pro-war narratives, the hero complexes in a lot of Western military media, and the violence that we readily accept as entertainment without a second thought. Here, the game points out that the very act of sitting down to play it is a decision that you've made, informed by those cultural attitudes the game sets out to criticize. And that's such a powerful statement to make. You know, say what you want about Firewatch and Undertale and the choices they give you, they never outright question your right to actually play through them. I know that Undertale asks you why you'd want to reset after getting the true ending, but that's only after you've been encouraged to play through it at least twice. In comparison, Spec Ops takes the unflinching, uncompromising stance that even playing this game to begin with is an act of complicity in the horrors you've witnessed, that you could have stopped, but didn't. Whatever you decide after that point, however you handle the white phosphorus scene, how you deal with the crowd, or even what ending you get, ultimately none of that matters. It is all secondary to the true thing this game is trying to say about you. That In sitting down to play this game, you are complicit in the exact same things it sets out to criticize. The pro-war narratives, the hero complexes, and the glorification of violence as entertainment. You have accepted your part in all of them. You have already made your choice. I've spoken a lot through this video on narratives, those we're fed, but also those we feed ourselves in order to remain complicit in unspeakable actions being committed. And while I've only mentioned this in context of video games, which ultimately don't matter in the real world, these narratives and their consequences do. And this complicity in the unspeakable resulting from narratives that we accept blindly is something that we're seeing happen in Palestine on a daily basis. So if you're going to make one choice that matters, I would ask for it to please be a donation to the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, which I've linked in the pinned comment below, for all of the humanitarian work they do for families in Palestine. If we're going to be aware of these culturally ingrained narratives and the harm they do, let's try and do what we can to help those who are harmed by them the most. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers!